Welcome to Football and Society, a new podcast exploring societal issues through the lens of the beautiful game. I'm Ash McMullin, and I'm joined by Chris Shipman and Norman Riley. Today, we'll be looking at player celebrations in the postmodern era. Goal celebrations have come to define some key moments for football fans, and we may even remember a player's celebration more than the goal itself. We are familiar with certain players' signature celebrations, and video games such as the FIFA series allow us to configure and perform our own celebrations when we play. Aníbal Mesa, Manuel González Ramayal, and José Castilla published an article in 2015 focusing on the historical changes in goal celebrations. In particular, they explored the transition from modern goal events to postmodern me events. As opposed to the collective celebration of a modern goal event, for the postmodern footballer, the me is emphasised in goal celebrations instead of the team. A footballer's second skin, which is a term describing the space underneath their shirt where messages may be displayed, has come to represent a personal space for the footballer, defined by individuality and distinction from their teammates. The article lists several examples of celebrations to analyse the emergence of the second skin and the me event. Players have dedicated messages to loved ones and family, and this expression of sentiment and feeling illustrates a humanisation of the icon, previously absent in the pat-on-the-back celebrations of the past. The study also finds that political statements, such as Frédéric Kanouté's message of support for Palestine in 2009, can introduce a political dimension in the presentation of the me event. Above all, however, these messages are secondary, even if the players don't mean it to be so. What is most important in postmodern goal celebrations, we are told, is the highlighting of me. We are delighted to welcome Aníbal Mesa, one of the article's authors, to discuss this research with us on Football and Society today. Aníbal is a lecturer at the University of La Laguna in Tenerife, Spain. Hello, Aníbal. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to share this time with you.
It's a pleasure. And can we begin by asking why you were interested in studying this topic?
Well, this is a kind of hobby thing, that you can translate to sociology. I think that is probably the most important thing that I was interested in sociology. That you can translate your hobbies, your personal interests to the to the academic thing, to the academic occupation. Manuel, Jose Luis, and me, we are very linked to football from all of our life, and at a moment we said we can do this. We can study all these social processes around football that, especially in Spain, are not very much developed. You in England and in Great Britain has a very strong tradition on sociology of sports and sociology of football, but in Spain, even today, we need to present a kind of justification to study football, because in certain sectors it's not very well accepted even today, when football is a global phenomenon, and as a sociologist we need to attend it.
Brilliant. Well, we really enjoyed reading this article, and the first question is, you claim the tipping point for individualisation of football was at the 1994 World Cup in the USA. Given its position as the poster child for capitalism, to what extent was the American location a factor in this tipping point? Would we have had the same tipping point had Brazil or Morocco, who were the other bidders, won the hosting rights instead?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. That World Cup must be understood as a bid by FIFA to conquer that market. It was a clear bid, looking for that, trying to take at least a portion of that incredibly big sport market that represents the United States. In that sense, for example, the customization of the players' jerseys fits in with something that had been operating in that way for many years in the US, in basketball, in baseball, in American football. even if we think, for example, in the equipments of the different national teams, we had their very innovative designs, colorful, all of these things together, saying us that it was very good plan that World Cup in that sense, not trying to conquer that market for football, or at least a piece of that market for football. So I think that perhaps that fact accelerate the process. But I think that finally it was a process that it was going on. And I'm almost sure that if the World Cup would have been celebrated in Brazil, probably the process would be very, very similar. Maybe not in Morocco, but in Brazil, as the cathedral of the global football, no? Probably all this process could be developed in the same way that it was in United States. But it's very important to think on that it was a very good design plan to conquer a new market, and as you said, the most important thing plays on our capitalism. No?
It's really interesting what you say there about the names on the jerseys and referencing baseball, American football, basketball, because I remember watching the '94 World Cup and thinking that one of the reasons I may have done it was because the US audience at that particular point in time, football or soccer as they call it over there, was so insignificant in terms of the percentage of people who actually played it. I think at the time I remember reading that football was less popular than big truck races, the massive trucks that they have. So I thought they must be putting the names on the shirts for the crowd to just get to know a bit about the players. So it was a really interesting World Cup, and I think before I move on to the next question, just a little bit of a funny memory. I don't know if any of you recall the Diana Ross taking a penalty during the opening ceremony. Do any of you recall that?
How can we forget?
Yeah.
What?
You know Diana Ross, Anibal. Diana Ross,
okay. Yeah.
Do you remember when she took the penalty in the opening ceremony of the US World Cup?
I didn't remember that.
Oh, it's one for YouTube.
You have
Got to check it out.
You have to go to YouTube.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the funniest things you'll ever see.
I'll do it. Okay. But as you said, it's very important because if you can think in the way, because we know that the comprehension of the sports in the United States is very different than in Europe. It's more linked to a show, no? That this image that we have with the fans eating the hot dogs and the popcorns during the match, all these things that are very strange for us in Europe. That when you can see the stands almost empty at the beginning of the second half of a basketball game or a football game, because the comprehension is very different there. You can imagine the impact for US audiences watching football in a World Cup without, for example, could identify the players through their jerseys, kind of collective dissolution of that sport that is strange for them. And I think that FIFA was smart thinking on all of that. But as I said, I think that the process was going on before, probably, if not in 1994 in USA, but in 1998 or at any moment in that period, that process would have been fulfilled.
Definitely. Couldn't agree more. I think the US World Cup and how FIFA were directing things behind the scenes at that point in time have led to where we are now, with especially the top level in European football, which is, it is now. It is more of a spectacle. There is a lot of there's almost like a Hollywood element to many of the top level games now, and I think obviously the USA to a certain extent was a bit of a template for that. Move on to the next question. Now, I don't know what it's like in Spain for players coming through the academy, so I can only ask this from a kind of English fan perspective, but the majority of players at the top level of the game, as it is now, have spent years in clubs' academies where they've been told what to eat and drink, how to behave, how to interact with the media, how to exercise, and I guess ultimately how to play the game. Additionally, the commercialisation of the sport, the saturated media coverage, and the scrutiny that players find themselves under have led us to a place where we see a carefully constructed footballer personality. Do you think it could be argued, therefore, that the personal goal celebration or the removal of the shirt or the message on the second skin are a form of rebellion by people who've spent most of their lives being told how they should behave? I guess almost a kind of rejection of the authority that's controlled them since childhood.
In one sense, we can think that, but for our perspective, it's quite the contrary. We see it as a consequence of those same control processes that you point out. We think that the loss of collective meaning and the emphasis of individuality is a late modern process that is well reflected in football. We can think even in the logic of the game itself, that today have been shifting towards a greater importance of the individual characteristic of the players, the speed, strength, physical development, as opposed to the collective tactical frameworks. So the underlining of the self fits perfectly with the professionalizing and mercantile logic of the game. We think that even players are told to do that. They are taught to do that, to underline the self in a more clear way, even when that thing could violate the regulation of UEFA, FIFA, and all the regulatory stances. So for us, it's more a consequence and not so much a question of rejection of the authority. It's more we understand more that process as a consequence of this process of individualization that we can check not only on this thing about the goal celebrations, even in other situations around football, like, for example, the regulation of the rituals. For example, at the finals of the most important tournaments and competitions. So we think that probably, maybe perhaps, it's necessary to seek rebellion in other places, in collective behaviors of dissolution of the self in favor of the community, and more collective behaviors. I think that they are more important in that term, more important in terms of rejection of the authority, that is more linked to give more strength to the underlining of the individuality.
I get the sense that in this kind of battle between the collective and the individual, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, that the individual will win out. And you say that there's little point in having numbers on shirts anymore. Given that, and regulatory bodies like FIFA, like UEFA, and their attempts to clamp down, how do you see the future of goal celebrations over the next decade or two?
Well, it's a very different question. Sociologists are really bad seeing the future. We are always making mistakes about social development, social direction, social trends. But we can see on our work, we can see a clear trend to develop more and more the regulatory efforts. The regulatory efforts are conquering spaces. That is something that by now is clear for us. All this regulatory effort that we can see almost at every aspect of the game, because, for example, all the regulation about the equipment and for example, the media disposition covering the game. So almost every aspect is being more and more regulated by FIFA, by UEFA, etc. We see that this will continue to shape certain behaviors and therefore generate new escape points too. In terms of the use of the second source, things seem quite clear. We can see that the sanctions have been reducing the phenomenon, and that regulation is pushing footballers to explore new ways to underline the self. Even today, we can see new elements, like, for example, the Cristiano Ronaldo celebration with this screen, no, with this. It could seem stupid, but it's a kind of brand. It's a kind of element that identify Cristiano Ronaldo as a self, as an individuality. Yeah, and players are looking now for different ways to do that, because this question of second share is not allowed now. So you can see, I don't remember when I saw the last celebration with the second share. It's in Spanish football and even in international football. I don't remember now. I don't remember now that. So the consequence is that the precision to send a message that is developed through the second share, because with the second share you can send a precise message. Now the ability to deliver concrete message is diluted. So therefore we can think of a future that in one way is reinforcing, is increasingly giving the strong dynamics of individualization, but at the same time that individualization is being more neutralized as acts of rebellion, as you said before, or as a social and political commitment, because it's not allowed anymore. So we have more individualization, more underlining of the self, but in a more neutralized way, less committed, less political, with less social commitment, and at the same time more defined by the process of commodification. Yeah, no, more linked to the market, more linked to the business of football. But we need to keep focus on that, because under every process of regulation, the conditions to escape of that regulation are created. So we're going to see in the next years new things on that way, new developments by the players or by the fans that defy the regulations and try to, in certain way, reject the authority that is regulating all the public arena of the game.
Absolutely. You got me thinking there, actually, Anibal. You mentioned that you kind of see players with, the second skin, the actual T-shirt on less now than what we may have even seen a few years ago. And it got me thinking about this kind of, these FIFA regulations and control of how players are on the pitch. And it got me thinking of tattoos, actually. And I know that obviously, wider society, and at least in a Northern European context, full sleeve tattoos all over the body have become really, really popular over the last sort of, 10 years, you could say. And you obviously notice that in footballers as well. There are so many footballers with lots of body art. And it does make me wonder whether or not if football hadn't have clamped down so hard on how players celebrate goals and how they express that individuality, whether or not the actual amount of footballers with loads of tattoos would have exploded. It's an interesting thought, but I mean, I'd obviously not be able to work out the answer. But there is a kind of a show of the self through the tattoos. I feel footballers, you can actually read quite a lot about their personalities and the tattoos that they've got. I don't know if you pick up on something similar.
Yeah. I think that is very, very, very interesting thing to study. I think that we could say another paper focusing only on these things, not only on the use of tattoos, but even the use of the whole body as a kind of second share, in a different way that we talk about in the paper around the Mario Balotelli's celebration, and more understood like if the body were a blackboard to write message on them. But it's interesting to think about that, because now that thing is out of the regulation processes by institutions. But we don't know what is going to happen in the future, because it could be one dimension that the institutions could try to regulate. It's more difficult because we are talking about the body of the players, but at the same time that they are regulated, the equipment, all that aspects that I told before. It's not so crazy to think about institutions trying to regulate the kind of tattoos and the message that tattoos are sending, that players could, at least in visible parts of the body, wearing the uniforms of the teams. It could be interesting what could be the development of this aspect, and of course, if this aspect is becoming an important part of goal celebrations and the underlining of the cells. That already is like that, no? Because as you said, it's a very common thing in football players now. Of course, are linked to the public presentation of the self, of the public presentation of the personality, or this question of tattoos. So it's a very, very, very interesting issue to pay attention.
See if you can get the funding from your university, Annibal, and do the paper, will you please?
yeah. No. We now are in a kind of a transition situation, because we have studied for a long time, for a couple of years, this question about the rituals on the finals of the biggest club competitions, specifically UEFA Champions League and Libertadores Cup. And now we are finishing all these studies about rituals and transitions that we are expecting to publish them in a certain important journal. But we now are thinking about what is the next step for us. So maybe this question of tattoos could be a very good point to start to change the subject. Yes.
I've heard various explanations for why footballers are actually forbidden from removing their shirts after scoring, including possible offence caused and shirt sponsors protesting because their brand is absent during the celebration. From your perspective, what is the underlying motive for this regulation? Is it simply to have more control over the player's second skin?
For us, it's not so simple. We understand it as a part of a more general process, not so linked to specific explanations like that. Obviously, these practical reasons that you remark are there, and they have their importance. But in the analysis for our paper, I want to say that it's only focused on professional football. We verified that the increase in regulation is a continuous and growing process. And as I said before, for the example of the equipment regulation is clear. It doesn't just have to do with the second skin or the aesthetics of the players. As I said, in more recent works, we have studied the rituals associated with the final of the most important club competitions, and we have verified the same. We have identified a process of complexity of these rituals and an increasingly exhaustive control by the regulatory institutions. We associate that in this works that I told with the idea that football is shaping that what we could call a global trade. We talk about the global trade of football that is overcoming the obstacles that multiculturalism presents for any project of these characteristics. If we think in all these projects of global civilization like United Nations or even the European Union, always the question of multiculturalism represents a problem to unify the sense of the union. No? But that problem is overcome by football. Why? Well, this can be explained in part through the simplicity of the game itself. Its 17 basic rules are easily understood by anyone all around the world. All around the world understood the basic scheme of football. No? But for us, it's more important that its consolidation and stabilization as a global element fundamentally depends on its homogeneity, to be understood in the same way in anywhere on the planet. I think that we think that that's the point, to increase the regulatory processes, to keep the game, the product, the brand unified all around the world. That is not subject to different process of globalization that could make the game to be understood in relative different ways in different places, that could erode the strength of the phenomenon, the strength of the brand, finally. So we believe that is the key. The regulatory institutions need to control every last aspect of the product so that their brand continues to be recognized globally. And as I said before, that is not being significantly transformed through those globalization processes.
That's a really, really interesting answer, and it got me thinking actually of a couple of things. Sorry, I'm just going off slightly from the next question. Yeah, it got me thinking immediately of, you referenced the 1994 World Cup, and I recall the launch of Major League Soccer in the US coincided with the end of the 94 World Cup, and immediately given the sort of hyper neoliberal society that is the US, and it was back then obviously as well, they tried to change the rules almost straight away. They had every game had to have a winner, so there'd be a penalty shootout. That wasn't a penalty shootout; it was actually running with the ball from the halfway line. And it's really interesting because that is actually it fizzled out after a couple of years, and it went back to the what we would call normal football rules. So that's a really, really interesting answer you've given there. And the second thing I thought of was, obviously we're recording today on the day that Diego Maradona's died, and it just got me thinking of the Maradona's background. And he was brought up in a very, very sort of impoverished part of Buenos Aires, and he literally didn't have a football, but he's still managing it, and it's because of that, as you say, that kind of homogenized set of regulations that literally anyone in the world can actually play the game, and to keep it at that kind of basic level, or to maintain control so that everyone around the world is playing at the same rules. I completely understand why that would be. So yeah, thanks for that. That was a really good answer, and it's got me brain rushing in all sorts of directions now. But I will move on. In the article, you say that the postmodern footballer promotes an individual brand and puts their emotionality in public view to express authenticity. It got me thinking about Papi Cisse and Demba Ba at Newcastle, who would celebrate one another's goals by praying together. So the goal scorer knows the cameras will be turned to them, yet they don't address the cameras. That's a quote from the article. And it made me wonder how you might define a celebration that consists of a thanks to a higher power.
Well, you made me think a lot about that, because it's very, very interesting, and especially in terms of the categories that we use in our paper, and these two categories. That this one, when we talk about solidarity, second skin, as a kind of public performance showing certain social commitment through that solidarity or politic, if you can say politic too. Second skin, in front of the intimate second skin that is more personal, is the player throwing to the public arena his emotions and intimate life. This question about Papi Cisse and Demba Ba, I was watching the goal celebrations. I understand that as a mixed situation between these two typologies that we talk about in the paper, the solidarity and the intimate. There is an important point here. Cisse and Ba are not sending a message to the public sphere through their celebration, at least not in a direct and unintentional way. As you said, they are not looking for the cameras to do that. It seems that they are putting into play a purely personal aspect that is relevant to them, the religious feeling. But there is not a concrete message, as you well point out, and not even a search for the transmission of the message. We might even think that if there were no cameras, the celebration would be the same. It's a very personal thing for them. From this perspective, we could link it to that intimate second skin that we talk in the paper. They are performing something very, very emotional and intimate for them. They are not looking public relevance of that. So we can match this celebration on that intimate category, but with that important nuance of intentionality, of course. But at the same time, on the other hand, although both players do not deliver a specific and direct message, their gesture places them in the public sphere and provides them with recognition within their community. The religious commitment here can be compared even to the political commitment of Kanouté that we talk about in the paper, writing in the second share Palestine in a difficult moment in the situation in the Middle East. We say in the paper something like that. The underlining of the self is tied to a specific element of the public sphere and identifies the football player with a commitment. the self is vindicated and endowed with content. Of course, again, this is not done directly by Cissé and Ba. We can conclude that there is no message as long as there is no intention. But finally, it's impossible to escape the mediatization of current football. The cameras are there, and you are asking about that because it's public, no? Because it's there. The celebration of Cissé and Ba is there, and it's relevant and call our attention. So whether they like it or not, the self of these players are strengthened and legitimized within their community doing that. And at the same time, they are rejected by people who condemn those kind of practices. So it's very interesting because we can understand that celebration as a mix with this conjunction of this process. It's at one side is intimate, is an intimate celebration, but at the other hand, that celebration has a public impact and situate the players in a recognized public sphere and link with a specific community.
Brilliant answer. And there is another paper that I think that you may well need to write in the future. So
that was very interesting. When I was thinking on this, it's a whole subject to pay attention.
It just made me think of Mohamed Salah, who has a celebration that's very similar to those two former Newcastle players, and I think perhaps in a way has been slightly differently responded to, maybe by virtue of time. But there was a really fantastic documentary on the BBC about a year or so ago about the cultural power of Mo Salah, and particularly the way that within the Muslim world, his portrayal and very visual representation of very positive Islam was very much, as you say, there was a degree of support for that within his community. But it just made me kind of wonder whether there is, to a degree, a kind of reinforcing nature. So maybe at the start, there's an element of doing it almost irrespective of the cameras. But when that support and that grows, maybe there's an element of building upon that and it kind of reinforcing. But I'll carry on. Just away from the notion of second skins as purely a kind of shirt-based thing, I wanted to talk about a slightly different type of celebration, which is one where masks are involved, and two players here that kind of come to mind. One, Aubameyang, who is very fond of pulling a mask out of a sock or wherever and putting it on his face, and another player that's very close to my own heart, and I know Norman will agree, Jonas Gutierrez, and the famous Spider-Man mask, which unfortunately we didn't see enough of, but we did see on occasion. How does the notion of wearing a mask in a celebration fit into that notion of a second skin?
Of course, it's a different kind of celebration. It's not as we said before. It's using the body in a different way, using an external object to make the celebration. So it's relatively difficult to think on this celebration as we talk in our paper, but we can do it. We believe that in terms of meaning, we could consider it a hybridization between emotional identification and cultural claim, especially when Aubameyang explained the celebration. Okay, Aubameyang explained after the game that the representative animal of his country's national team, Gabon, is the panther. That was the link with Black Panther. No? He said, I feel represented by Black Panther. But at the same time, we know that Black Panther is a cultural product of vindication of blackness. At least at the beginning, in the absence of the player's explanation, that celebration could be understood as a gesture of ethnic pride. The difficulty here lies in the limitations of non-verbal language. That's the difference. That's the main point to try to understand this. With the second shirt, we don't have that problem because the message is clear. The message is clear, and we don't know too much interpretation to understand it. But with these kinds of celebrations, like Aubameyang one, we need that explanation because of that limitation of non-verbal language. So after the explanation, we can understand it as an intimate one. No? It's a personal question. It's reflecting one emotional aspect of this player. No? But yeah, it's interesting that before that explanation, because sometimes that explanation could not be done. So before that explanation, you can understand that celebration as a vindication of blackness and a gesture of ethnic pride. So it's very, very interesting that, because the text in this message, the text is the mask and the gesture associated with it. So that makes very difficult the interpretation of the type of underlining that is intended, because it requires more clarification, and that limits the depth and impact of the message. But it's very interesting because it seems clear that the places of enunciation in the body are multiplying, as we said before, talking about the tattoos. So the whole body is a place of enunciation. Of course, a hand is not equal to the head, the body gesture is not equal to a written text, and the interpretations are multiplying too. So it's difficult to think and to try to concrete these kind of celebrations in our scheme. That was only focused on the clear message that is thrown out with the second shirt.
You've been mentioning race in that answer there, and I remember in 2005 Samuel Eto'o was subjected to racist abuse from opposition fans, including monkey chants. And when he scored, he actually celebrated by dancing like a monkey and said afterwards, "I danced like a monkey because they treated me like a monkey." I was interested in what you think of what you call the dialectic narrative involving the fans and players in this context. Is Eto'o effectively performing in line with their expectations of these racist fans, or is he creating new meanings and transforming that moment into one of renewed empowerment and resistance?
For us, this is a good example of how linguistic deconstruction processes work. Here, the sender of the message suffers an impact when his aggression tool, in this case the simian sounds, is reappropriated by the victim as a vindication process. Here it's very important to understand the gesture of Eto'o associated with the moment, with the celebration of a goal. Because the celebration of a goal is a moment that is the greatest personal highlight that the player can enjoy during a football match. So it's a moment of very important underlining of the self, the celebration of a goal. You are saying, I'm here, I'm the best, I'm the maker. Right? This is my moment in the game. So it's very important to understand that gesture link to that moment. Yeah, Eto'o takes advantage of that moment and takes the opportunity to claim, in this case, his monkey status. Yeah, sending a message of the monkey superiority to those who try to use this characteristic as an unequivocal element of inferiority. Is taking the advantage of that moment when he is the main, the most important player of the game, of the match in that moment, and he's saying, "Here is the monkey scoring the goal to your team." No, so he's taking that aggression tool that I said before, reappropriate, and using it as a kind of rejection of that aggression and a kind of gun, a kind of tool to take a different position in that discussion, not being only a passive receptor of the message, taking a more aggressive position and taking even a dominant position in that discussion. Yeah. Other example that it was famous here in Spain, it was Dani Alves eating a banana that was thrown to the field. I don't remember very well. I think that it was in a corner or an onside kick. Yeah, the banana was thrown beside him, and he took the banana and eat without any other expression. He didn't match the fans to do that gesture, but he didn't want to give too much importance to that moment. Yeah, and after the match, in the press conference, when journalists asked Dani Alves around that moment, he quits importance to that. And certain people criticize Alves for not take advantage of that situation to talk about the problem of the racism. But I don't know if you remember that after that, Neymar Jr. used this banana thing on his Instagram, I think, or maybe Twitter. He generated a kind of trend involving different players, especially black players, eating a banana and rejecting the racism. So that, especially the Neymar understanding of that situation is very important to understand the same thing that you are pointing out with the Eto'o example. Yeah, you are taking something that is throwing against you, and you are rebuilding it to take advantage of your visibility and your position of certain superiority in a certain moment to reject the message that is previously being sent.
It's incredibly powerful. Those two incidents you mentioned were incredibly powerful, and I think they resonated deeply. And to me, it's almost the equivalent of the raised fist. They're incredibly powerful statements in their own way. Obviously, deeply disgraceful and upsetting that these things take place, but the reactions of Eto'o and Alves in their own individual ways were incredibly impactful, and they took the debate in a way that it wouldn't have gone necessarily if they hadn't have reacted at all. So as far as I can see it, they were very powerful moments of self-empowerment, and I'll use the word power again, but all power to them for doing it. Annibal, one more question, if that's okay with you. You state that the World of Goal celebrations has become an example of how the struggle for recognition has passed into the political arena above the struggle for redistribution and class vindication. Can you explain in more detail what you mean by this?
Basically, here we are talking about the success of the growing process of individualization. Within that general debate between redistribution and recognition that we know that has been very important during the last decades, especially inside the ideological left. We know that the move to post-industrial capitalism fragmented the strong collective identities that characterize the working classes and the labor movement that were based on the similarity of tasks, goals, and living conditions. Now, with the dominance of the service sector, and now even more with the new information technologies, we are building more isolated individuals with less chances of developing meaningful connections with others in relation to their material conditions. In this way, these spaces for collective articulation have been occupied by identity movements. Mm-hmm. We just have to take a look at the social unrest that we can find in our societies today. Racial, gender, or sexual orientation issues occupy the most visible space against the traditional social movements around the trade unions. We can say that the struggle for identity has become more important, or at least more relevant in terms of visibility, than the struggle for the redistribution of resources. That is what we appreciate in the changes in goal celebrations. We have passed, and this was very, very good developed in a paper by Mark Turner from the Southampton Solent University. We have passed from a collective logic of a strong gregarious nature and little individual emphasis in the search for a common goal, a kind of analogy of workers' organization, to a very strong emphasis on the self, on the individual characteristics of the protagonist of the goal, that sometimes even appears that completely isolated from the group to which he belongs. The focus on the individuals and the actual football sometimes create that sensation that the players are able to make the things isolated from the rest of the team. No? That here, as we told before, sometimes it seems that Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi are able to win the games by themselves, no? Completely isolated, respect the rest of the team. And we established this analogy between this struggle between redistribution and recognition to the change that we can check on the goal celebrations from a collective dynamic that was the most important trend on 50s, 60s, and 70s, even 80s, to this underlining of the self more and more strong, especially after the 90s to the present.
Hannibal, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. I know it's gotten me thinking, and I'm sure it's gotten the other guys thinking, and of course the listeners as well. Just before we go, the big question, perhaps, what is your favorite goal celebration of all time?
My favorite goal celebration. I really don't know, but I really like celebrations that remark the collective aspect of the game. For example, in this debate between in Spain was very strong. All this discussion about what is the best player, Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi. One of the focus points was the behavior respect the rest of the team. And I think that the kind of celebrations that both players developed, it was a good example of the different views that they represent. Because no, Cristiano Ronaldo has this gesture that is always the same at that screen, and he is very good underlining himself. But Leo Messi usually, when scores, automatically is looking for the mate that made the play, no, that made assistance. So he's looking at a kind of collective dimension of the protagonism of the goal. And for me, I really love that kind of celebration that put the focus on the social aspect of the game, of the communal aspect of the game, underlining the the collective dimension, that the importance of all the team to elaborate a goal that finally is scored by the player, but not only by a player, of course. So I really like that kind of goal celebrations.
Hannibal, that is a far more thoughtful and better answer than the one that I would have given, which probably would have been Matt Ritchie lamping a corner flag into some poor bloke's nuts. So, props to you for that. How can listeners follow you in your work?
Several of our works are published in academic journals that regards specifically about football aspects, like Soccer and Society or the International Journal of the History of Sport. Now we are trying to publish our last work with Sport in Society. That is another journal from Taylor and Francis.
And if anyone wanted to put questions to you, would you be happy to receive an email from them?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hannibal. We will be back very soon next week.
If you enjoyed this show, then please do head to your listening platform of choice and leave us a review. This will help new listeners to find us. We would love to hear your thoughts and questions on today's show, so please do connect with us on Twitter at FootballSocPod. Thank you for listening to the show and supporting the Football and Society podcast.